Hello and welcome to the Global View on this Monday. Well, let's check what's going on at a macro level. US jobs growth slowing in October as strikes by car manufacturing workers depressed payrolls. The unemployment rate rose to 3.9% last month, the highest level since January 2022, while non-farm payrolls increased by 150,000 jobs in October, well below the 180,000 forecast by a majority of economists. In the 12 months through to October, wages increased 4.1%, the smallest increase in 2.5 years. Meanwhile, the US services sector slowed for a second straight month in October, with the non-manufacturing PMI dropping to a 5-month low. While the softer than expected economic data boosted stocks and bonds, it has raised concerns of the possibility of recession in the States. Now, in response to the jobs numbers, US 10-year yields fell as low as 4.48% and the 2-year yield was down to 4.8%. And the US dollar fell to a 6-week low after the data showing fewer US jobs were created than forecast, reinforcing expectations the Fed is likely to hold interest rates steady again at its December meeting. The Aussie dollar trading higher at 65.1 US cents. Well, in his visit to China, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has said China has the right to practice free and fair trade and has expressed confidence that its remaining sanctions on Australian exports will be lifted. Well, for analysis of Australia's diplomatic and trade relationship with China, I spoke to international strategist Cynthia Dearin. She's worked for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade while also becoming the first female chief executive of the Australia Arab Chamber of Commerce and Industry.
Place at the moment is really important. Obviously, we've come out of a period of kind of deep freeze, both politically and in a trade sense. That's had some very negative impacts for Australia, but it's part of a larger geopolitical picture, right? So, I mean, the US and China are kind of locked in this ongoing long-term structural conflict, which we've seen escalate over the last few years. And Australia kind of can't help but be part of that because we're walking a tightrope between our relationship with China, which we've seen be very significant on the trade front over the last 20 years or so. And on the other hand, our relationship with the US, which is, arguably our key alliance. And so this visit is a really important step to restarting things on all fronts. So I think, it's important from an Australian point of view. It's a step in the right direction. It's a kind of an olive branch, but it is also an olive branch from the Chinese side. And that's part of what is going on with all these complex relationships. So, on one hand, we've had China release an Australian journalist who was incarcerated for a number of years, and at the same time China is reaching out to journalists in other places around the world and having visits and having political meetings and starting up the relationship again, because China also needs Australia, China needs the US. So I think it's a thaw because there needs to be a thaw for the benefit of everybody.
Do you see that trade between Australia and China is perhaps now back on track, or is it a little too early to assess that? Because once again, Anthony Albanese reiterating the need to adhere to the rules-based trade system, I guess, pointing to obviously the WTO.
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's coming back. You can see that tariffs are starting to come off some of the things on which they were placed after Australia called for that inquiry into COVID back in 2020. So we've seen tariffs start to reduce or come off altogether. There are still some tariffs that are pretty significant. I guess in a symbolic way, tariffs on things like Australian wine, tariffs on lobsters. Those are not crucial to us in the way that a tariff on coal would be, for example, because obviously that's one of our major exports. Wine is a significant export, but it's nowhere near the volume of coal. Same thing for live lobsters. But I think it's very important from a symbolic point of view. So I think trade is getting back on track, but the point about a lot of these tariffs were that they damaged key Australian industries. They were punishment, but they didn't really do any damage to China as such. I mean, China went elsewhere and secured relationships with French wine producers and Chilean wine producers to our detriment. Of course, I think China does need to abide by rules-based trade. Obviously, we have a free trade agreement with them signed by Andrew Robb when the Liberal government was back in power, back in the mid-2010s. We need to adhere to that, but I think, it's a sign of a thaw.
Do you feel as though perhaps Australian businesses selling into China have cause for optimism at this point, be it from iron ore to lobster to wine, that perhaps they can see that opportunity? I mean, obviously iron ore has not really been affected, but obviously some of those other industries have.
Look, I think there is cause for optimism, but this is a long game, right? This is not suddenly, hey, we have one prime ministerial visit and everything goes back to normal, and that's because of these long-term structural factors and these two global powers, China and the US, that are conflicting with each other, and then the countries like Australia who are middle powers that need to align themselves with one side or the other. And I think that's going to be the challenge for Australia. We used to do it very, very well. For a long time, we walked this tightrope of trading with China and also working very, very closely with the US from a security point of view, from a political point of view, from a trade point of view. That all kind of fell apart once the Trump administration came into power, once we had COVID. That's now trying to be put back together. But I think the trading relationship over the long term is going to be affected by these long-term structural factors.
We also saw that Trans-Pacific Partnership pretty much collapsed because Donald Trump pulled the US out of it. But China appears keen to, I guess, get that back on track with the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. What's that likely to amount to, do you think?
I think there's going to be a lot of caution about letting China in, because a lot of commentators on this subject look at what is happening with China and the kind of the rapprochement between Australia and China, between, to some extent, the US and China, and a lot of people feel as though it is tactical, as though China is looking at the world political and trade scene, seeing a lot of united fronts, seeing a lot of alliances. The US has done a lot of work to align its position with the EU. The US has done work to align with Japan, South Korea and Australia and get those three countries on the same page. And so China doesn't really like it when its allies are aligned against it. It starts to, to feel as though it's on the back foot. And so a lot of people feel that what's happening at the moment is kind of a tactic. And so I think there's going to be a lot of caution about having China join that trade agreement, because the risk is that if you have a major party like that join an agreement and then they renege on their commitments, that drastically weakens the credibility and the stability of that agreement.
So, Cynthia, while we see perhaps more optimism, cause for optimism there in terms of trade with China, less so with the EU, with those talks of a free trade deal essentially collapsing last week.
Yeah.
Where to now then, if they're likely to get that back on track?
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, look, let's be realistic. The EU is this massive trading bloc of 445 million people. It's not that we don't trade with them already. We do. There is fairly significant trade, but we were looking for a better deal. And obviously the EU has some very, shall we say, conservative and protectionistic policies, particularly around agriculture. And, agriculture is one of our largest exports. We're a very free and open economy when it comes to agriculture, and so we've been looking for that reciprocity with the EU. We haven't seen that. Unfortunately, that's not a new issue. That's an issue that's been running for a very, very long time. We're talking 20, 25, 30 years. So I'm not sure whether we can expect significant change. I think perhaps we can expect change in the margins, but in terms of significant breakthrough, there's no real sign of it right now.
So do you feel as though the EU is going to maintain those protections for the safeguards for European farmers? Because you're not getting that breakthrough, are you? Particularly, as far as beef, dairy, sugar and the like.
Yeah. Oh, look, I think in many ways it might be political suicide for them to do otherwise. They have to think not just about what's happening externally with their trading relationships, but what is happening internally with the voters. And although the collapse of those talks got a lot of airtime down here in Australia, if you look at world press, I did a search over the weekend, it scarcely rates a mention. So that says to me that it's a lot more important for us than it is for the EU.
Cynthia, let's turn to the Middle East and just how contentious that is, and clearly of concern. You've got a background there with the Australia Arab Chamber of Commerce. You've advised, particularly as far as relations between Australia and business in that area. What's your assessment of what is going on there right now, with the potential perhaps that this conflict could escalate and widen?
Oh, look, I mean, I think it is a terrible humanitarian crisis. It's a crisis on all sides. What Hamas did was clearly really, really wrong and entirely unexcusable. But if you stand back and you look at this with a long lens, it was also not entirely provoked. If you want to stand back and look at the last 75 years of history, it's a huge problem that's not going away anytime soon. And I think, there is a real risk of escalation. I don't think escalation would be in anybody's interests. But I think if you look at the rhetoric that is coming out of at least some of the countries in the Middle East, the ones in particular that are closer to Israel and closer to Palestine, you can see that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with what's happening. I mean, the former foreign minister for Jordan has been on air this morning talking about what the right response should be. I think, though, in other parts of the Middle East, there is less appetite for conflict. And also there are some very tight alliances between countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia with the US. And so there's going to be a lot of pressure from the US not to escalate the conflict. But I don't think you can ever roll it out. I mean, we've seen a cycle of violence in Palestine and in Gaza in particular that's kind of looped round and round and round from time to time over the last 75 years. And I think, the most kind of recent egregious examples would be that ground invasion by Israel in 2006, where you started to see Hezbollah get involved in that conflict as well. Any escalation is going to be bad for the region, it's going to be bad for the world economy, and it's going to be bad for anybody who's wanting to trade in that part of the world.
Prospects of a two-state solution seem as far away as ever now, but is that the only solution?
It seems to me to be the only credible solution, because neither side really wants to give much ground. Both sides would like sovereignty. Plenty of people on both sides who would love nothing better than a peaceful life and to, live happily and bring up their kids. But I mean, while you have these ongoing issues and you have clashes over territory, it's difficult to see how that can be the case.
All right. Interesting too, we saw former Prime Minister Scott Morrison make a visit along with Boris Johnson. Were they likely to have any influence over there, do you think?
It's a good question. Without a significant political platform, hard to say.
All right. Should the Australian government make representations over there, as in with a visit from either Penny Wong or Anthony Albanese, do you think?
Oh, look, I think, if we think it's a matter of importance, sure.
That is Cynthia Dearin, international strategist, with her comments on, global geopolitics at the moment. All right, that is the global view. We are preparing for what should be a higher opening there, as you can see, with SPI futures up around 1/5%. Stay with us, the open is just around the corner.